Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I'm joined today by Jonah Walters. He is a postdoctoral scholar at the Institute for Society and Genetics, the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also the co-editor, along with René Rojas and Bhaskar Sunkara, of the new book, The Good Die Young, The Verdict on Henry Kissinger, available from Verso. Jonah Walters, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thanks for having me.
So Henry Kissinger, Dr. Kissinger, as he preferred to be known, died last year at the age of 100, hailed by some as great statesman of our age. He had many friends in Washington on both the right and among liberals. Huge fans include Samantha Power, Hillary Clinton. After, of course, Henry Kissinger is also one of the most controversial statesmen of the 20th century, and some might consider him to be one of the worst butchers of the second half of the century, with a great deal of blood dripping from his hands. Pretty clear where the contributors to The Good Die Young stand. This book was released by Jacobin magazine as soon as Kissinger's death was announced, which suggests that it had been in preparation for some time. So let me start by asking you, Jonah Walters, why did you and Jacobin magazine think Henry Kissinger was so important and so necessary of commentary that you had a secret book prepared on him, ready for release at the moment of Kissinger's death?
Well, that's a great question. It's a very fair question. I think that our thinking when we planned the book, and we began working on the book all the way back in 2015, I guess, sort of in the final days of the Obama administration, and then continued working on it throughout most of the Trump administration, and had the manuscript basically locked around 2018, 2019. But the reason that we thought that Kissinger warranted this kind of attention and this kind of analysis is because he, first of all, exerted such a high level of influence over American foreign policy for such a long period of time. And also, the period of time during which he exerted this influence was really crucial for the larger story of American ascendancy in the 20th and indeed 21st centuries. And so Kissinger offered a really convenient personality to examine, a really convenient career to trace. And I think we also understood that it was quite likely that whenever Kissinger did die, which of course happened last year, there would be a lot of people in this country and around the world who would be really eager for a new kind of conversation about the legacy of American foreign policy in the 20th century, and would be looking to understand Kissinger not only as, an especially offensive personality or some sort of aberration that haunted the halls of Washington for decades, but instead to understand him as an embodiment of official American policies, and to begin to ask questions about what those policies were and what kinds of consequences they've had for the world we lived in.
Yeah, I think that's critically important. It's one of the things I really like about the book is that it gets past just Kissinger as a uniquely malevolent character, which it's very easy because he is in some ways a uniquely malevolent character, but you put him in his context and you say, well, okay, but what does his life and career, what does that tell us about U.S. foreign policy more broadly? But let's go back to the basics here first, because there are young people in the world, they might only know Kissinger as a sort of cartoon villain. And so perhaps you could first start by giving us a refresher, a little overview of who was this man.
Sure. Yeah. So Henry Kissinger was, first of all, an intellectual. He was someone who came out of a cohort of foreign policy intellectuals that was especially based at Harvard, but sort of had a presence throughout, American academia in the 1960s. He's often, thought of as a Cold War intellectual, as a defense intellectual. He really was somebody who saw himself as an intellectual inheritor of this tradition of European statecraft that was all about the preservation of great powers and about influencing the economic and political development of the world over the long durée, over very long periods of time. That was certainly the story that he told about himself, that he was this uniquely well-educated person who sort of understood the way that history moves and the ways that history can be influenced. Practically, though, he sort of arrives on the scene in Washington in the late 60s, early 70s, initially as President Nixon's national security advisor. While in the Nixon administration, he manages to create a uniquely close relationship between himself as an unelected advisor and the president, who actually, had his finger on the lever of American power during this period. He manages to isolate a lot of other people that were around the president. He completely isolates the elements in the Defense Department during the Vietnam War that were perhaps warning about the infeasibility of winning that war. And he contributes to Nixon's quite ferocious war-making policies during that period. And then even after the fall of Nixon, the sort of spectacular end of the Nixon administration, Kissinger, emerges relatively unscathed. He proceeds then to stick around the halls of Washington for decades after that and serves not only as national security advisor to other presidential administrations, but eventually as Secretary of State as well. And even into, the 1980s, during the Reagan Revolution, he is tapped at some key moments to sort of validate what the Reagan administration is up to in Central America, especially. He once again crops up after 9/11 as a member of the Congressional Commission to investigate 9/11. Interestingly, he ends up resigning that post because he, at this point in his career, had established a very influential consultancy that, as we put it in the book, sold its world-breaking capacities to all kinds of power brokers and businessmen around the world. And he was ordered by Congress to divulge the list of his clients if he wanted to serve on the 9/11 committee, and he refused to do that. But the point is that he begins his life as a Cold War intellectual, as a defense intellectual. He establishes an extremely close relationship with Nixon, and then he rides the prestige that he generated during the Nixon administration for the remainder of the century and indeed into the 21st century.
And before we get to what he did with power and more on how he viewed the world, what you said there suggests that this is a guy who has a real knack for figuring out self-advancement in the halls of power. And he also, notable fact about him is he's very good at branding himself as, and not just being an intellectual, but branding himself and selling himself. There's an interview in the book in which it's pointed out that he writes these books that are these kind of tomes, that are these kind of grand treatises on world order. In fact, world order is the title of one of them. But actually, they're pretty unoriginal. But he manages to sell himself as this great deep mind of foreign policy. And he also attracts just an extraordinary amount of media attention. Early in the book, you have all of the attention that was put on him in the early 70s, where he's known as the playboy of the Western Wing, and Women's Wear Daily, as you point out, is writing profiles of this man.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. He was, throughout his entire career, an exceptionally capable self-mythologizer. And so at various moments in his career, he's able to brand himself, as you say, in slightly different ways, depending on the historical moment or the sort of cultural moment that he's occupying in the U.S. So you're right. In the preface to the book that I wrote with my co-editors, we have some great fun describing the 1960s, 1970s version of Kissinger, when, as you say, he was something of a sex symbol. He was being celebrated on the pages of Playboy magazine. He was appearing regularly in the columns of New York City-based gossip columnists. He was famously, being discovered in the Hollywood pools and mansions of famous actresses. And then as his career develops, he, of course, transforms his public image into various versions of, an avuncular elder statesman. The only adult in the room was another sort of brand that he was able to secure for himself, particularly as he got older and some of his previous actions were called into question. And it's really significant, I think, to me, that it was really only with his 100th birthday, shortly before he died, that I began to see some really serious dings to his reputation in the mainstream media. I remember when we were first beginning to work on this book in 2015, it was really unusual to see Kissinger criticized much less, to see someone entertaining the idea that Kissinger may in fact be a war criminal or, criticizing him in a severe way like that. And instead, what was much more common was that you would see these completely celebratory and uncritical accounts of his career as both a statesman and an intellectual. And we sort of expected, as we were working on the book, in fact, that the book would be released into a cultural atmosphere that was uncritically celebrating the man and his leg. That's obviously not what happened. I mean, the book came out last year at a moment when really people from all sides of the political spectrum, but in particular progressives and liberals, were really reevaluating Kissinger. And it was much easier to criticize him than it was to praise him.
It's interesting. When Kissinger died, I'll just read a headline here from Reuters. Biden praised Kissinger in life, offers measured reaction on his death. And it says that Biden actually was kept his distance a little bit from Kissinger's legacy when he died. And I think it was the case that like every president had him to the White House at one point. He was very close with Democrats. Like maybe Bernie Sanders had something to do with this because he famously said when he was running against Hillary Clinton, Henry Kissinger is not, he might be your friend. He's not my friend. And I'm proud that he's not my friend, and pointed out what a lot of people knew, but hadn't said up until that point.
Yeah, I think that was a really significant moment. And if you remember, Bernie took some heat for that statement in the mainstream press. I mean, that was presented as an incautious and irresponsible thing to say about this great American statesman. But I think it's clear now that Bernie's gotten the last laugh on that issue, at least.
Now, to what extent is Kissinger's importance overstated? Because obviously you, as we've mentioned, you've done a whole book paying attention to him. So obviously you consider him a deeply significant and important figure. But you also mentioned that he is a self-mythologizer, self-aggrandizer, a person who wants to inflate his own reputation for being the guy making the policy. So to what extent is he an architect of U.S. policy versus a symbol for, a representative of?
That's a great question. And I don't think that that's necessarily one that we can answer right now. Like, I think that there's still a lot of historical work that's going to be done in the decades to come, evaluating exactly how much influence Kissinger had at various moments. In fact, one of the contributors to the book, Carolyn Eisenberg, just released a book last year about Kissinger and Nixon, and was able to consult a lot of documents that hadn't been previously available to sort of get a picture of what they were really up to, each of them as personalities during the Vietnam War. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that work. In broad strokes, though, I mean, to answer your question, there were moments when Kissinger, I think, was extremely influential, really was an architect of American foreign policy. And some of those moments include some of the most cynical and destructive decisions that were taken by American leaders in the 20th century. I mean, I'm thinking especially of the illegal and just massively destructive bombing of Cambodia, which in a lot of ways really was Kissinger's project. I mean, he and Nixon were sort of joined at the hip on a lot of things, including the Cambodia bombing campaign. But it's really shocking to think about that moment in history. What was happening is that Kissinger, who was an unelected Ivy League elite who had no legislative mandate, no electoral mandate to be making decisions of any kind related to American foreign policy, was personally selecting bombing targets in a country with which the United States was not at war. And not only was personally selecting bombing targets, but had also developed this actually quite sophisticated system for masking those bombing targets by literally destroying flight records. So that's clearly a moment where Kissinger is acting as an architect of U.S. policy, and the decisions he's taking in that role are having really severe consequences for millions of people.
Right.
There are other moments, though, just to say, where he certainly was playing much more of a symbolic role, and I think has tried to overstate his significance to some other moments in 20th century diplomatic history. And so it's really challenging to parse out when exactly he's exerting control and when he's taking credit.
I just want to dwell on what you said, the consequences for people, because not only is this man an unelected official secretly determining what the most powerful military in the world is going to do to countries that he decides are going to have violent force exercised against them, but the ultimate result of the Cambodia bombing, not only the hideous loss of life for the people directly impacted by the bombing, but something that the United States also deserves a fair deal of blame for is the subsequent rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. One of the worst genocides of the 20th century is, not entirely, but in a significant part, a direct result of the U.S. bombing campaign. So, it's bad enough when you just look at one man making decisions to use violent force illegally, and then when you actually look at what happened as a result of Kissinger's choices, it really is. It's difficult to even wrap your mind around just the immense amount of human suffering.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And there's a great contribution in the book from the journalist Brett Morris about Cambodia, which goes into exactly what you're describing, and also points out that people in Cambodia continue to live with the material consequences of that bombing campaign in the form of unexploded ordnance. I mean, there remain thousands of unexploded bombs buried beneath layers of soil in Cambodia, which can and still do explode and kill and maim people to this day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I want a quote from the introduction of your book is, "The reason for Kissinger's bipartisan appeal is straightforward. He was a top strategist of America's empire of capital at a critical moment in that empire's development." And you elaborate that the power elite in Washington committed itself to defeating challenges to capitalist hegemony wherever in the world they emerged. And to that extent, the American national security state deployed everything from support from reactionary regimes to economic sanctions to election meddling. Could you elaborate on what you mean? Because I want to get down to what Kissinger's worldview and his function was. Can you elaborate on what it means to be a top strategist of America's empire of capital?
Sure. Yeah. So it's really important to place Kissinger in this moment in the larger historical context, as I've been saying. So what we argue in that introduction is that coming out of World War II, the world is significantly transformed. And the United States takes on a new geopolitical role in this significantly transformed world. And that role is as the guarantor of a global capitalist market system. Whereas previously there had been a historical period that was characterized by conflicts between capitalist powers, particularly in Europe, after World War II, there was this definitive signal sent to the inhabitants of, what would soon be known as the Third World, that European colonialism was unsustainable, and that there was an opportunity on a global scale for the creation of an alternative sphere of influence and trade, or maybe many alternative spheres of influence and trade. And coming out of the Second World War, the previous European powers, or the European powers that had previously exercised a certain degree of hegemony over regions of the world, were no longer able to fulfill that role. The United States, however, had become a capitalist power without rival on the world stage extremely quickly. It had replaced Great Britain in particular as one of the most powerful military in the world. And it assumed this role as the geopolitical guarantor of global market society. And it's important to sort of be careful about what that means, because that doesn't mean simply checking the Soviets. It doesn't mean defeating international communism in the way that Cold Warriors like Kissinger were very often describing it. Instead, what it means is using the power and influence of the United States, not only its military, but also its Federal Reserve, for example, to prevent what people like Kissinger saw as subordinate nations from acting on their own to create an independent sphere of influence and trade that could threaten not only global market society, but also the United States' place as the hegemon over that global market society. And so that's really the function that Kissinger is playing. And it's not just him. I mean, this is the official objective of American foreign policy in the second half of the 20th century, is to preserve a global market system under American hegemony. And I think what makes Kissinger so significant and so useful to look at and to think about is that he understood that policy perhaps better than any of his peers in the American foreign policy establishment. During the time that he was alive and influential, really embodied that will to act that the architects of American foreign policy saw as America's duty and prerogative in the world.
You're listening to the Current Affairs podcast from Current Affairs magazine in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Current Affairs is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we depend entirely on reader subscriptions and donations. You'll notice we have no ads, no mattresses, no recruiters, no sports betting. If you can help us in our mission to build independent progressive media, please visit currentaffairs.org/donate to make a donation, or currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our beautiful print magazine. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Now, back to the program.
There's a certain appeal to his honesty. I mean, obviously, he's a very dishonest man. He's lied to Congress multiple times, but his kind of lack of idealism. I know the official biography of him is called The Idealist, but his statements like, covert action isn't missionary work, he has some pretty vicious stuff on the record that is not where he abandons a lot of the usual fluff about our deep commitment to the uplift of peoples around the world. And it's pointed out in the, I think in the Vietnam chapter of your book, I think it might be by Caroline Eisenberg, someone points out that in the entire record of the transcripts of conversations around Vietnam, there's not one instance of Kissinger showing any compunction about the deaths of human beings, and not the slightest hesitation, whether it's US troops or whether it's Vietnamese civilians. The idea that individual human lives are important to the decision making just sort of doesn't enter his mind. And also when he was asked about Cambodia, there's an extraordinary quote where he's asked, do you have any regrets? And he said, I fail to see what the moral issue is. Not even I disagree with the moral conclusion, but I can't even grasp why anyone is raising a moral question about the bombing of Cambodia.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And he was throughout his career just a uniquely forthcoming about his embrace of atrocity. And I think that's also part of why he makes such a convenient figure for mustering a political and moral critique of American foreign policy. You're exactly right that the kinds of, humanistic language that often is wrapped around American military intervention, Kissinger seemed quite allergic to that kind of language. He didn't see the point in justifying his actions to the American public or to the global public or to anyone. And so you do get these quite revealing statements. Another thing that's worth saying about Kissinger is that he, as part of his lifelong campaign to self-mythologize, the origin story that he very often told about himself had to do with his beginnings as a young Jewish boy in Germany whose family was facing persecution from the Nazis and who, in fact, fled the Nazis and came to New York City when he was just a child. And he, of course, attends school in the United States. He even briefly begins his studies at Harvard, and then he's drafted into the U.S. military at the end of the Second World War. And he returns to Germany. And in Germany, he participates in the denazification efforts around the particular town where he's based. So his origin story is very much about observing firsthand the excesses of the kind of military posturing that took place in the first part of the 20th century and that resulted in calamity in Europe and displacement for his own family. And so he did attempt throughout his career to present himself as a check on that kind of excess, as one of the, as I said, one of the adults in the room who could prevent the particularly destructive and cruel outcomes that he knew instinctively were possible. The great irony of him, of course, is that he was able to present himself like that successfully for so long, even as he himself personally had a great deal of responsibility for some of the most cynical political decisions that were taken during his lifetime.
I just remembered another one of my favorite honest Kissinger moments, which is he was asked in 2005 why he supported the Iraq War. And he replied, because Afghanistan wasn't enough. In the conflict with radical Islam, they want to humiliate us, and we need to humiliate them. Never mind bringing democracy to the people of Iraq,
Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned that you wanted to get to Kissinger's worldview.
Yeah.
And I think it's debatable to what extent we can even identify a coherent worldview. But exactly that attitude that you're describing crops up throughout his career. I mean, it's not just the on the matter of Afghanistan and Iraq. He also was quite explicit about the fact that he wanted to exert American military power in Angola during the 1970s because he felt that America had been humiliated in Vietnam and that there was the need for a new conflict, a successful conflict, to catalyze American will and American spirit on the world stage. I mean, he was quite open about his feelings about war and violence as being forces that create national identity and therefore are positive.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we could go a little deeper into how the task that you elaborated for us of kind of maintaining US dominance and a certain kind of global economic system, how that drove specific policy. So, and I'm thinking of Chile here, and maybe you could explain how it all fits together, right? I mean, one of Kissinger's most infamous acts is his participation in his encouragement of the successful, essentially, elimination of Chilean democracy in 1973. A Marxist social democratic president, Salvador Allende, comes to power. The Nixon administration is scandalized and horrified, immediately tries to put the squeeze on and organize a coup against Allende, which succeeds a couple of years later. However, if we look at it sort of neutrally, we might wonder, why did they care so much, right? I mean, what happens to the Chilean economy doesn't really affect US business very much. What is the motivation there? How does that fit in? You know, what explains this kind of pathological need to make sure that Chile does not have a Marxist social democratic president?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it really gets at the heart of what Kissinger was up to during that period and throughout his life. So I think the first thing to say, it's important to emphasize that ensuring the health of American business is different from ensuring the health of American businesses. And what I mean by that is that I think quite often there's this reflexive urge, particularly for those of us on the left, to make very direct schematic connections between the actions of the American state, especially overseas, and the particular short or midterm interests of specific US companies. And sometimes this is the case. I mean, there's been a lot that's been written about having to do with the 1954 coup in Guatemala, for instance, which the United States supported in response to largely because of lobbying from the United Fruit Company, which stood to benefit a great deal from that upheaval. But particularly in the kinds of diplomatic and military episodes we encounter in Kissinger's career, there's much less of a direct connection. So Chile is actually a fantastic example because there's no question that Allende did pose a certain kind of threat to some specific American corporations, particularly mining corporations that were operating in Chile. Allende very famously continued a policy that had begun before him by nationalizing the copper mines. And copper is extremely important in Chile. Chile is, in fact, in some ways similar to like a petro state, but just with copper. It's just a very important part of the national economy. Notably, after Allende is removed from power, Kissinger and Nixon don't insist to their friends in the new Pinochet regime that those properties be returned to American and Canadian mining companies. In fact, Pinochet maintains state control over those mining companies and uses them to fund his government. And so, so the first thing I'll say is that we need to be careful to distinguish between the health of American business writ large and American businesses as specific businesses. So then what is so threatening about Allende and his Chilean road to socialism from the point of view of Kissinger and Nixon? I mean, I think that really what was going on in Chile, and really the reason that Chile was such a preoccupation for people like Nixon and Kissinger, was because Allende threatened to cohere around himself and around the coalition that he represented a new regional sphere of trade and influence. There was a real possibility that Allende's democratic road to socialism not only could inspire imitators elsewhere in the region and the world, but also could exert some real geopolitical clout, could begin to reformat geopolitics and trade in such a way that would allow for the advancement of independent initiatives on the global stage that were brought by, as I said, what Kissinger would have called subordinate countries. And that was really threatening to the geostrategic project the United States had taken on during this period. I mean, it was really threatening the possibility that Allende could cohere around himself and around his coalition a new kind of politics in what is now known as the Global South and then would have been known as the Third World. And in fact, that's a through line through basically all of Kissinger's actions on the world stage throughout his career, is that there existed a cohort of countries that previously had been quite constrained in the possibilities that were available to them by the, largely because of the strength of the European colonial powers, that were attempting to move on their own and to create a new kind of political and economic common sense for the world, or at least for their parts of the world. And Kissinger and his allies in the American security state moved swiftly to undercut those initiatives whenever they emerged.
Perhaps you could give us another example from somewhere else in the world of the same kind of philosophy and action. I mean, your book essentially ranges across the whole world. The structure of the book that you've chosen is geographical. It begins with the first section is the Americas. You talk about the Chile example, you talk about Argentina, Central America. Then you go to Europe, you look at Cyprus, then you look at the Middle East and Africa, and then you conclude with Asia from East Timor to Cambodia to Vietnam, China, Bangladesh. Obviously, we can't go through all of the examples in this conversation, but perhaps you could give us another that particularly stands out and maybe that people don't know about.
Sure. I mean, I think that one really important event that took place during the Nixon administration that gets overlooked quite often, I think, is the end of fascism in Portugal and the Portuguese state relinquishing control over its overseas colonies. So this includes colonies in Africa, famously Angola, Mozambique, but it also includes other places where the Portuguese had exerted a great deal of influence in the years prior, including East Timor. So I think that this serves as another great example where there was a European power that was fast becoming cleaved from its colonies. Portugal, interestingly, was a rather tenacious European colonial power. It held on to its holdings longer than some of its peers in Europe. But by the mid-70s, it was, Portuguese colonial control over territories in Africa and Southeast Asia was unfeasible. And so they released them. They relinquished control over them. And almost immediately, the United States stepped in to guarantee that the kinds of regimes that emerged in those places would not be threatening to American or to larger capitalist global interests. And so in Angola, quite famously, the United States throws its support behind a just famously corrupt national liberation movement that was not supported by the majority of the Angolan people, but crucially, was not a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary organization, in fact, opposed the existing Marxist-Leninist revolutionary organizations in Angola. And this results in just an absolute military fiasco for the United States, frankly. I mean, the United States, through its clients in South Africa, encourages South African intervention in Angola, which is then met by a Cuban intervention on behalf of Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries in Angola, which completely pushes the South Africans out, humiliates them militarily, and in many ways sort of sets the stage for the end of white minority rule in Southern Africa writ large. And then another big consequence of this historical moment is, culminates in the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which of course had been a Portuguese colony and sort of an independent self-governing polity briefly, and Indonesia, which was just extremely important for the American foreign policy establishment during this time. I mean, throughout this period, Indonesia, the threat of communism in Indonesia is just one of the largest anxieties that's circulating in Washington. And I mean, there's been some attention recently on the very famous or infamous 1965 massacre of the Indonesian Communist Party. And, shortly after that, about a decade after that, there's a threat to the very United States friendly government that had been installed in Indonesia coming from revolutionaries in East Timor. And the United States provides arms. Kissinger personally, in fact, guarantees the shipment of arms to Indonesia to assist them in just absolutely crushing this movement for self-determination in that part of the world.
I want to conclude here with the subject of your last chapter, which is by contributor Christy Thornton, which is From the War Room to Wall Street, which is about his kind of post-government career, this consulting firm Kissinger Associates. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how his business activities after leaving government illuminate the workings of the global capitalist system that you describe as being committed to the maintenance of. The final line of the book, just a little bit of a spoiler, is the times are nothing if not uncertain. Where there's uncertain, Kissinger's company has been indispensable to the interests of global capital. Maybe you could tell us if you look at his business career, what it tells us about how this system really works.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought up that chapter because I think that's one of many real gems in the book. I think Christy Thornton's chapter on Kissinger's sort of career after government, or his sort of peri-governmental career as a private consultant, is one of the most unique contributions to our book. There's been a startlingly little attention, I think, paid to Kissinger's work as a private consultant. So just to set the scene a little bit, so Kissinger founds this company called Kissinger Associates, which is very quickly just tremendously lucrative for him personally, and also provides a destination for people leaving government jobs or cycling between government and private sector jobs, which, elevates the firm's popularity and its prominence, not only in the United States, but around the world. And what that firm does is it provides personalized feedback, advice on sort of key geopolitical issues to the leaders of private companies, to multinational companies that are operating in multiple parts of the world simultaneously. And as Christy points out in her great chapter, I think her term is the scourge of the international investor is uncertainty. International investors, particularly very large, high-powered international investors that are operating at a very high altitude of influence, want to eliminate uncertainty as best they can. And Kissinger obviously was in a position to assist them in eliminating that uncertainty by, for example, providing twice annual briefings that were always done in person and orally, so as to never leave a paper trail, by assembling dossiers on particular world leaders or particular world regions, and helping to reassure the managers of these large multinational companies that the messy business of politics wouldn't interfere with their profit taking. And I think that part of the reason that we really wanted to have this contribution in the book and to really turn our gaze towards Kissinger's work as a private consultant in the final pages of the book is that looking at this history really emphasizes that global capitalism, such as it is not a system that sort of emerged and metastasized of its own free will, so to speak. It's a system that has been constructed and that is continually reconstructed and maintained by powerful actors. And Kissinger, while he was alive, was among one of the most powerful actors that was each year, each day, reiterating this global capitalist system, not only by providing advice to those who were benefiting the most from this capitalist system, these multinational companies, but also by moving to quell any challengers to that system as well.
Well, to find out how he managed to quell challenges to that system around the world, our listeners and readers will have to pick up the book you have co-edited, The Good Die Young, The Verdict on Henry Kissinger. It's pretty unequivocal in what that verdict is, but as we've touched on here, the book is a nice example of, it's kind of unique in the way that it uses the story of one person's life in order to get beyond that person and to tell us how these underlying systems actually operate. Even if you have no interest in Henry Kissinger after his death, you might be interested in looking at the world through the lens of Henry Kissinger's life in and out of government. So people should check out the book, The Good Die Young. Jonah Walters, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.